$1 billion. That's what Canada and Saudi Arabia signed onto paper in a single afternoon in Jeddah. 13 separate agreements, inked in one room, while almost nobody in North American media noticed. And here's the detail that makes this matter far more than a routine trade signing. The last time a Canadian Prime Minister set foot in Saudi Arabia was 26 years ago. This wasn't a courtesy visit. This was the first time in over a quarter of a century that Canada's head of government has walked into that country. And he didn't leave empty-handed. He left with commitments spanning mining, critical minerals, infrastructure, health technology, and defense. Categories that, not long ago, would have been unthinkable to put in the same sentence as Canada-Saudi relations. I'm Connor Mackenzie, and this is Canada Plus 24. Every week, we break down exactly what's happening between Ottawa and Washington. Not the spin, not the outrage headlines, just the structure underneath them. Today, we're looking at a story that barely made a ripple in mainstream coverage, but might matter more to Washington's negotiating position than any tariff announcement this year. To understand why this trip is significant, you need to go back to August of 2018. That summer, Canada's then Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, posted a statement expressing concern over the arrest of Saudi human rights activists and called for their immediate release. Saudi Arabia's response was swift and severe. Riyadh expelled Canada's ambassador, giving him 24 hours to leave the country. It recalled its own ambassador from Ottawa. It froze all new trade and investment transactions with Canada. It suspended student exchange programs affecting more than 16,000 Saudi students studying in Canadian schools. The state airline even canceled flights to Toronto. Freeland didn't back down at the time, telling reporters that Canada would always stand up for human rights. But the practical result was an 8-year deep freeze in one of Canada's most significant Middle Eastern trading relationships, a rupture that only began to thaw in 2023 when Justin Trudeau and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman quietly agreed to restore full diplomatic ties on the sidelines of an APEC summit in Bangkok. That's the backdrop Mark Carney walked into this week. Not a blank slate. Not a routine ally-to-ally visit. A relationship that had spent nearly a decade in the deep freeze, thawed only recently, and had never once been tested by an actual prime ministerial visit. Until now. It's worth remembering what was actually on the table when that freeze happened in 2018. Before the rift, annual trade between Canada and Saudi Arabia sat at roughly $4 billion, anchored partly by a controversial $13 billion contract to supply Saudi Arabia with Canadian-made light armored vehicles, a deal signed under the previous Conservative government in 2014 and allowed to proceed by Justin Trudeau's Liberals in 2016, despite intense pressure from human rights groups to cancel it. When the diplomatic break hit 2 years later, that entire relationship, arms contract included, was thrown into uncertainty overnight, with reports at the time suggesting Ottawa quietly explored ways to unwind the LAV contract entirely before ultimately deciding the financial and legal cost of cancellation outweighed the political discomfort of letting it continue. It took until May of 2023, on the sidelines of an APEC summit in Bangkok, for Trudeau and the Crown Prince to even agree to formally restore ambassadors and reopen the door. Even then, restoring an ambassador is not the same as a head of government actually walking through that door in person. That's the gap Carney closed this week. This visit didn't happen in a vacuum. Carney landed in Jeddah in the middle of renewed fighting between the United States and Iran, with Gulf shipping lanes coming under Iranian attack in the days surrounding his trip. Canada's government publicly condemned those attacks on Gulf shipping and reaffirmed its support for regional security while Carney was still in the country, meaning this wasn't simply a trade mission dropped into a quiet news week. It was a Canadian Prime Minister choosing to plant a flag in one of the most geopolitically volatile regions on Earth, at the exact moment that volatility was spiking, rather than waiting for calmer conditions. That timing is itself a signal. Business Council Chair Jeff Steiner, who has watched Canada-Saudi commercial ties for years, called Carney's visit a high watermark for the relationship. His words, not a Canadian government talking point. And Saudi Investment Minister Fahad al-Saif told Carney directly that the kingdom is open for long-term investment, specifically pointing to infrastructure, aviation, and critical minerals as the sectors where Canadian expertise is most wanted. When the person controlling investment decisions on the Saudi side is naming your country's specific strengths back to you, that's not a courtesy statement. That's a country actively trying to recruit Canadian capital and expertise into its economy. Carney arrived in Jeddah on Wednesday, July 8th, fresh off the NATO leaders' summit in Ankara, Turkey. That routing matters on its own. Carney didn't fly home to Ottawa between commitments and then plan a separate Gulf trip later in the year. He moved directly from a NATO summit focused on European and transatlantic security straight into a Gulf capital focused on economic diversification, treating both stops as part of the same continuous diplomatic push rather than two unrelated items on a calendar. The next day, he met directly with Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman, and the two governments issued a joint statement covering trade, technology, mining, natural resources, energy, health, education, and defense. 13 separate commercial agreements and memorandums of understanding were signed on the spot, together valued at more than $1 billion. The agreements weren't vague statements of friendship. They named specific companies and specific sectors. Canadian engineering firms Hatch and Atkins Realis, formerly known as SNC-Lavalin, were directly involved in the signing ceremony. The commitments cover Canadian companies supporting mining and critical mineral projects inside Saudi Arabia, as well as Canadian infrastructure firms helping deliver pieces of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 development plan, including roads and rail lines. Carney didn't stop at signing paperwork. He met separately with Saudi Aramco's CEO, Amin Nasser, and with Bob Wilt, head of Saudi state mining company Ma'aden. Both companies sit at the center of Saudi Arabia's push to diversify its own economy beyond oil into mining, minerals, and industrial infrastructure. The two governments also established a new Canada-Saudi Arabia Coordination Council operating at the foreign minister level, specifically designed to keep this cooperation moving instead of letting it stall out the way it did after 2018. And this wasn't even the first move this year. Back in January of 2026, Canada's Minister of International Trade, Maninder Sidhu, led a business delegation to Saudi Arabia that produced roughly $600 million in its own commercial agreements, touching clean technology, artificial intelligence, and infrastructure. Carney's trip built directly on top of that, meaning in a single 7-month stretch, Canada has moved from $600 million to well over $1.6 billion in new commercial commitments with one Gulf economy alone. That's not a single splashy announcement designed for a press cycle. That's 2 separate ministerial-level trips, 7 months apart, each producing binding commercial agreements rather than vague memoranda of friendship. It also matters what Saudi Arabia is actually trying to buy. Vision 2030 is a concrete, multi-decade plan to build the kingdom's economy beyond oil, and it requires exactly the kind of engineering, mining, and infrastructure expertise Canadian firms have spent decades developing at home. Hatch and Atkins Realis didn't get invited to Jeddah because of goodwill. They got invited because Canada has genuine, exportable expertise in large-scale infrastructure and engineering. The same expertise that built Canada's own mining sector, its hydroelectric systems, and increasingly, large-scale rail projects here at home. Saudi Arabia isn't looking for a symbolic partner. It's looking for companies that already know how to execute projects at this scale, and Canada has a track record most countries can't match. Riyadh has already signed similar large-scale infrastructure and mining partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and several European economies over the past few years as part of the same diversification push, which tells you something important. Canada isn't being handed a favor here. It's competing for a seat at a table that other advanced economies have already been fighting to sit at, and it just won one of those seats. Here's the moment from this trip that deserves far more attention than it's gotten. Standing in Jeddah, Carney was directly asked why he was pursuing deeper ties with a country his own predecessor had clashed with for years. His answer, reported by multiple outlets covering the trip, was that he is seeking new investment and trade partners specifically to help make Canada less reliant on the United States, this country's single largest trading partner. Read that again. That's the sitting Prime Minister of Canada on foreign soil, explicitly naming reduced dependence on the United States as a goal of a trade mission. During the same year, Washington has spent rejecting a CUSMA renewal and maintaining tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos. This is exactly the strategy we've tracked on this channel for months. Every time Washington raises the cost of doing business with Canada, Ottawa doesn't spend its energy pleading for a better deal. It spends that energy finding somewhere else to sell, to invest, and to build. Saudi Arabia, a $1.8 trillion economy in the middle of an enormous, decade-long economic transformation plan, is exactly the kind of partner that makes that strategy real instead of theoretical. Tariffs work as leverage under one core assumption, that the country on the receiving end has nowhere else profitable to go. That assumption is the entire foundation of using trade pressure as a negotiating weapon in the first place. Every tariff threat against Canadian steel, aluminum, or energy only bites as hard as it does because, historically, close to 3/4 of everything Canada exports has gone to a single buyer, the United States. Take that concentration away, even gradually, and the same tariff percentage simply doesn't hurt as much as it used to, because there's somewhere else for the affected industry to redirect its output and its investment. Every deal like the one signed in Jeddah chips away at that assumption, one contract at a time. It's not that $1 billion in Saudi agreements replaces the scale of Canada U.S. trade, which still runs into the hundreds of billions annually. Nobody serious is claiming that. It's that the direction of travel matters more than the current size of the number. A pension fund delegation from Canada is already scheduled to return to Saudi Arabia within months, specifically to explore further opportunities, likely in infrastructure and long-duration assets that suit institutional investors like the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne is actively working through double taxation issues between the two countries to make future investment easier, a bureaucratic detail that sounds small, but is usually the single biggest practical obstacle standing between an agreement in principle and actual capital moving across borders. Trade Minister Sidhu's January visit and Carney's July visit are two data points on the same upward line, not a one-off headline. And notably, the sectors involved aren't trivial ones. Critical minerals and mining are exactly the categories the United States has spent the past 2 years trying to lock down exclusive access to through its own negotiations with Canada, precisely because Washington doesn't want to depend on China for the materials that go into everything from electric vehicle batteries to defense systems. If Canada is simultaneously signing critical minerals cooperation agreements with Saudi Arabia, that's Ottawa demonstrating in real time that it has other buyers and other partners for exactly the resources Washington has been trying to treat as a captive supply. Saudi Arabia, for its part, has its own reasons to want in on this. The kingdom has been investing heavily in domestic mining capacity through Ma'aden and has made critical minerals a named pillar of Vision 2030, meaning Canadian mining expertise and Canadian mineral supply chains fit directly into a strategic priority Riyadh already had before Carney ever landed. And notably, the sectors involved aren't trivial ones. Critical minerals and mining are exactly the categories the United States has spent the past 2 years trying to lock down exclusive access to through its own negotiations with Canada, precisely because Washington doesn't want to depend on China for the materials that go into everything from electric vehicle batteries to defense systems. If Canada is simultaneously signing critical minerals cooperation agreements with Saudi Arabia, that's Ottawa demonstrating, in real time, that it has other buyers and other partners for exactly the resources Washington has been trying to treat as a captive supply. Saudi Arabia, for its part, has its own reasons to want in on this. The kingdom has been investing heavily in domestic mining capacity through Ma'aden and has made critical minerals a named pillar of Vision 2030, meaning Canadian mining expertise and Canadian mineral supply chains fit directly into a strategic priority Riyadh already had before Carney ever landed. There's a financing dimension to all of this that rarely makes it into the headlines but matters just as much as the announcements themselves. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund has become one of the largest sovereign wealth funds on the planet, and it has spent recent years actively hunting for exactly the kind of stable, long-duration infrastructure and mining assets that Canadian pension funds and Canadian companies specialize in building and operating. A pension fund delegation returning to Saudi Arabia within months isn't just a symbolic follow-up trip. It's the mechanism through which announcements like the one signed in Jeddah actually turn into deployed capital, years-long construction contracts, and ongoing operational revenue, rather than staying as one-time signing ceremony numbers. That's the part of this story that takes the longest to show up in the data, but it's also the part most likely to determine whether this becomes a lasting shift in Canada's trade posture or another headline that fades once the news cycle moves on. Add the defense sector into these agreements, and the picture sharpens further. A Canadian defense industry with additional non-American revenue streams and partnerships is a Canadian defense industry slightly less dependent on staying inside Washington's good graces to keep functioning. Given that the original 2014 light armored vehicle contract already tied Canadian defense manufacturing to Saudi demand, this trip effectively reopens and modernizes a relationship that had been frozen in place for the better part of a decade, at a moment when Canada's own defense sector is under pressure to diversify its customer base regardless of what happens with Washington. To be fair to the full picture here, this trip hasn't been universally praised inside Canada. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand said she personally raised human rights concerns, along with specific consular cases involving Canadian citizens, directly with her Saudi counterpart while in Jeddah. Domestic critics have pointed to Saudi Arabia's human rights record and to the unresolved shadow of the 2018 rift as reasons to question how enthusiastically Canada should be embracing this relationship. Some of the same advocacy groups that pushed Ottawa to cancel the original LAV contract back in 2018 have already raised concerns that expanding defense-adjacent cooperation now risks repeating that same mistake, just under friendlier branding. Carney's own response to that criticism was direct. Asked whether he was more focused on business than on human rights disagreements, he said that engagement is not endorsement. Pressed further, he added that lecturing other countries tends to be ineffective, a notably different posture than the one Ottawa took in 2018, when public criticism was the entire strategy. That's a real, legitimate policy debate, and it's one worth having honestly rather than pretending it doesn't exist. But whatever position you take on it, the trade and diversification logic underneath this trip stands on its own. Canada can pursue new economic partners for strategic reasons, while people at home continue to debate the human rights dimension of who those partners are, and both things are true at the same time. Saudi Arabia isn't the only place this strategy is playing out. Canada has spent the past 2 years quietly expanding trade conversations well beyond its traditional American anchor, deepening ties across the Indo-Pacific, continuing to lean on its existing trade agreement with the European Union, and now adding significant new agreements across the Gulf. None of these relationships individually rival the scale of Canada-US trade, which still runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. But that's exactly why the strategy is designed the way it is. Not to replace the American market overnight, but to make sure that market stops being the only serious option on the table. That distinction matters enormously for how much leverage a tariff threat actually carries. A country with no realistic alternative buyers has to eventually accept whatever terms are offered, because the alternative is losing access to trade altogether. A country actively building a portfolio of alternative buyers, investors, and partners can afford to wait out a bad deal, because walking away doesn't mean walking away from everything. Every additional signed agreement, in Riyadh or anywhere else, moves Canada further toward the second category and further away from the first. There's a broader regional pattern worth flagging here too, because Saudi Arabia isn't operating in isolation any more than Canada is. The kingdom has spent the past several years positioning itself as a hub for exactly this kind of foreign partnership, hosting a steady stream of state visits and investment forums aimed at pulling in capital, expertise, and technology from allies across Europe, Asia, and North America. Canada showing up now, 26 years after its last prime ministerial visit, means Ottawa is entering that competition later than most of its peers. But it also means Canadian firms are walking into a market that already has a well-established appetite for exactly the kind of large-scale infrastructure and mining expertise Canada specializes in. Being late to the table isn't necessarily the same as being at a disadvantage, especially when the specific expertise being sought lines up this closely with what Canadian firms already do at home. It's also worth noting how unusual it is for a G7 leader to frame a trade trip this explicitly around reducing dependence on a G7 ally, in this case the United States, rather than simply describing new partnerships in neutral, additive language. Most governments navigating a difficult relationship with a dominant trading partner tend to avoid saying the quiet part out loud, sticking to language about growth opportunities or diversified markets rather than naming the specific country they're trying to become less reliant on. Carney did the opposite, on camera, while standing on Saudi soil. That's a deliberate choice, not a slip. And it tells you how much political room Ottawa believes it now has to describe its American relationship in those terms publicly, something that would have been far more delicate to say out loud even 2 years ago, before the tariff escalations and the CUSMA renewal fight had fully played out. Washington rejected a 16-year CUSMA renewal on July 1st, choosing instead a decade of annual reviews. Canadian infrastructure keeps expanding regardless of how those trade talks go. And now, in the same week that pattern was still playing out, Canada's Prime Minister flew straight from a NATO summit to Jeddah and came home with over $1 billion in new commitments from a completely different part of the world. None of these stories, on their own, ends the trade relationship between Canada and the United States. Nobody serious is arguing that. But stack them together, and a clear strategic direction emerges. Infrastructure that doesn't depend on Washington's mood, trade agreements that don't require Washington's approval, and now active diplomatic outreach explicitly framed around reducing dependence on the American market. Each one, alone, is a data point. Together, they're a strategy. And it's a strategy that makes every future tariff threat from Washington slightly less effective than the one before it. So let's go back to where we started. $1 billion, 13 agreements, signed in an afternoon, in a country Canada hadn't seen its own prime minister visit in 26 years, and an 8-year diplomatic freeze that ended not with an apology, but with a plane ticket and a signing ceremony. Washington can keep tariffs in place. Washington can keep CUSMA's future uncertain for the next decade. What Washington can't control is where else Canada decides to do business while all of that plays out. That's not a headline that trends for a day. That's the quiet math shifting underneath every trade negotiation still to come, and as always, we're going to keep tracking exactly where it leads. I'm Connor Mackenzie. This has been Canada Plus 24. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, the kind you don't get from a 30-second headline, do one thing before you go: hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We publish a new breakdown like this every single week, and if you want to actually understand what's happening between Ottawa and Washington, instead of just reacting to the headlines, this is where you'll find it first. I'll see you in the next one.